Hi, this is Teddy in Chicago, and you're listening to the Two Broads Talking Politics series on climate change.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. On our continuing series of episodes on climate change, today I am speaking with Lynsy Smithson-Stanley, who is the Partnerships Director at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. Hi, Linsy.
Hi, Kelly. Good morning, hon.
So we've got a bunch of stuff we can jump into, but maybe to start off with, could you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I've been in the climate change space for almost 10 years now. It really started when, I don't know if your listeners will remember, but there was a bill that almost passed, a cap and trade bill that would have been a federal regulatory system to cap the amount of carbon dioxide, but it failed. And after that, a bunch of the funders and thought leaders got together and said, hey, this wasn't just a political failure. This is a communications failure. And so there started to be a lot of intense focus on how do we talk about climate change in ways that resonate with people. And so I've done that from the elite media perspective with a little group called Climate Nexus. And then I wanted to work in the grassroots organization. So I led the climate engagement work at the National Audubon Society, the bird group. Shout out to anyone who's birding this weekend. And so as the conversation is changing around climate change, right? Like not only is it real, but how is it impacting us? How do we feel it and see it in our local lives? And what is it going to cost our communities, right? And then I consulted for a couple of years just doing exactly this. How can we talk about climate change in ways that match people's values and hopefully help people not only understand that it's real, but create a sense of urgency so that they take political action. And so I landed at YPCCC. That's what we call ourselves. This is a program that really goes back to 2008 when Dr. Tony Lyserowitz started asking via survey the American public what they thought about climate change, not just about the reality of the science, but what policies they would support to combat climate change, opinions and attitudes about clean energy, about the EPA, about all kinds of things. And he's been asking the same set of questions twice a year since 2008. And so that's become the Climate Change and the American Mind panel survey. And so from that, a bunch of people started to realize, hey, not only can we describe how Americans are feeling and thinking about climate change, let's put this data into the hands of practitioners. So nonprofit groups, leaders, and the media to make sure we're also communicating how important the issue is. And so the partnership program exists at YPCCC to help people working on climate solutions. So that can be clean energy, that can be as tiny down to a mayor, all the way up to the federal level. All kinds of nonprofits, and in some cases, even businesses, for-profits, think about, strategize, and work through climate change solutions and climate strategies with the aid of all this research that is generated by YPCCC.
All right. Excellent. So to me, this is sort of the big question, right? You know, I've thought about climate change for a pretty long time now, and there's solutions in terms of policy, there's solutions in terms of science, but what always seems to be difficult is how do we talk about it? How do we communicate it? What are people thinking about it? So what are some of the approaches that you take in your work to sort of figuring out how we talk about things, how we communicate things in ways that people will understand and will listen?
Sure. So I think the thing that I've taken away from working with different groups is that unfortunately now the impacts of climate change are so widespread and so intertwined with everything that we do on a daily basis that I think it actually offers us a great opportunity to talk to people about climate change based on what that person already loves or already values. So for instance, you know, it was really easy to talk about climate change to birders because we were able to describe, hey, why don't you share with me some of the changes you're seeing in the birds that used to stop in Ohio every year? And we were able to connect it to something that was already part of these people's lives because they had already demonstrated that they loved birds. And so the way that I think about it is I think we need to start framing our climate discussions more around values and less around just a recitation of scientific facts, right? So for instance, many of my friends are starting to have kids Many of them are back in Missouri where I grew up, and they're starting to have kids. And there's a wealth of literature now that shows that how climate change will cause its own as well as amplify existing public health threats. Right. And so that's how I've been able to very clearly link what I do, which sometimes seems kind of global on scale and kind of wishy-washy to my friends at home, with here's why you should care. Because it's going to mean that your kids can't practice outside at the same times. Because it's going to mean if your child has asthma, that he or she will be at higher risk. And so I've just tried to think about it in terms of, you don't have to make people love the earth or love climate change. You just need to connect climate change to what they already love.
So one of the things that I've always felt when looking at stories about climate change, articles, pieces, that the fact that the thing that always seemed lacking to me was sort of the action item in it. So, it seems like, climate change is this really big problem and people get sort of overwhelmed and scared, but then we don't know what to do about it. Is that something that you see? Is that something that the literature supports, that there should be something that people come away with, sort of a what to do next?
Absolutely. So, for instance, coming out of some of the public health literature, there is indeed evidence that fear can be a motivating factor. So, for instance, that we make people understand that they are fearful of what the planet will look like or what will happen to future generations in terms of being able to live the life that they want because of climate change. But they find that fear is a good motivator when coupled with a what to do. Right. And so, but I think you're exactly right that part of the challenge in things like newspaper articles is that you're talking to a broad public, and what to do can really be very varied. Pardon the double vary there. But that's all to say that there is absolutely something that all of us can do. But the literature says that the most important thing for you to do is that thing that's going to keep you doing stuff, the thing that's going to make you feel like you had a difference. Right. So that your actions mattered. And that is going to make you feel empowered to take additional actions. So for some people, that is indeed making lifestyle changes, whether it's changing their light bulbs or looking at native plants, or lowering their water use, or being willing to not use the air conditioner as much in the summer. But to your point, now that we know the scale of impacts, sometimes those personal changes can feel incommensurate. Right? They just don't feel like they're enough. And so I think the number one thing that we have to remind people is that our elected officials don't hear enough that we as constituents care about climate change. And the data are very strong in that over and over again, even in places like New York City, even in places like New York State, even in Illinois, that our elected officials do not see climate change as a priority from their constituents. And so whether that's the mayor and just telling her, hey, I just wanted to let you know that I really support your endeavors to move us away from fossil fuels more quickly, or the governor or your state legislature or your congressman, I always feel like that's the number one thing that people can do because of the evidence that says we're just not translating our concern into action enough.
Mm-hmm. One of the challenges of the moment on every issue is trying to find bipartisan solutions. Anything that people will agree on, everything seems so fractured right now that people can't agree on anything. So what does the data tell us about the partisan nature of this climate change debate?
I think the data are overwhelmingly positive. And if your listeners take one thing away today, I hope that there is so much more agreement on climate change and on the desire for solutions than I think many of our experiences in the media or even in our political lives would have us believe. So, for instance, even if we look just at Republicans, a majority of Republicans think that climate change is real. And that's across the United States and down into the county, right? So I think that's the number one takeaway, right? And then similarly, when it comes to the solutions, particularly around clean energy, things like investing in renewables, transitioning away from coal and toward wind and solar, even going so far as what President Obama did in 2015, the Clean Power Plan, where the EPA would have regulated carbon dioxide emissions. We see majorities of Americans across the board support those kinds of solutions. So I feel too like what the media and our little bubbles do is make this issue more fractured and more polarized than it actually is. And that's part of YPCCC's focus, is making sure that moderate Republicans know that their constituents overwhelmingly believe this is a problem and want to see action.
So right now, so much of our communications, so much of our media is sort of shifting toward social media, toward sound bites and short videos. Graphics are increasingly important. What are the kinds of things that YPCCC is doing in terms of, sort of figuring out how to navigate in that new media landscape?
We have a program called Yale Climate Connections. And what we're trying to do with that is that's our own media enterprise. And we're trying to generate stories. And there's a new story every day. Often it's on the radio. Sometimes it's just a blog. Sometimes it's a video. But it's a story that's no longer than 90 seconds that typically talks about someone who is either dealing with climate change in his or her life in, I think, perhaps unexpected ways, or people that are pushing solutions. So, for instance, we do a lot about kind of the unexpected ways that climate change is going to change our environmental dynamic. And one of our most popular stories this year was how climate change is going to affect the natural dog food market, right? And so, sure, you don't care about that unless you have a dog, but you know dog people, they're fiercely loyal people, right? And so constantly thinking about ways, again, to match what's happening with what's going on. And I think you're right. So for instance, we have a report coming out next week that will give the latest data on climate change in the American mind. So updated opinion data about what people think, what proportion of people fall into this category of what we might call alarmed. And you're exactly right. All weekend, we'll be thinking about how can we use maps? How can we make combinations that are one stat over a beautiful image? And so I think we think and spend a lot of time, how can we take this one report that is statistically rigorous and peer-reviewed and, let's be honest, a little nerdy, and what are all the derivative materials that one has to have ready to communicate? So that means we're working on Facebook, on Twitter, and a lot on Instagram. And that's from YPCCC and this Yale Climate Connections. And so every time we do something new, it's not just that PDF that goes online. It's what are the other small bite-sized pieces of information can we use so that people are seeing the message not this once, but lots of times. And I think that's the other thing is we see that people just aren't hearing enough about climate change. You know, it's my job, so I have a very skewed view. But then when I talk to my parents, I realize that a week or two could pass and my parents haven't seen anything about climate change on the Kansas City news. They haven't seen anything about climate change on the world news. They haven't read anything, right? And so we try to think about what are the little bite-sized facts that we can have ready to put across all the social channels. Oh, and I forgot YouTube, that people are participating in conversations.
Do you find that you have things that can go viral? Is there some sort of trick? Maybe I'm speaking a little selfishly here, but is there any sort of thing in common among the kinds of things that end up getting a lot of press, that end up getting really popular, maybe even viral sharing? Is there something we can look at and say, aha, we understand why that, so I'm thinking of like the stuff that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is doing with Green New Deal. Like why is that sort of thing actually catching on?
I think that's a very multi-layered question.
Yes.
Right. So I think you're right. I think one is things that are surprising, right? So people respond well to things that are surprising. So when we do remind folks that majority of Republicans support the kind of policy proposals that don't sound like good ideas, if you hear from federal Republican representatives, those do very well. And then I think we do have to navigate a tension, particularly at YPCCC, of kind of the old guard and the new guard. Right. And so I think that part of AOC and the Green New Deal and what that's caught up is that it's this reimagining of this very great historical moment when we were able to come together and the government was able to pass some reforms that, looking back over the years, we know did well in terms of FDR's deal. Right. But I think there hasn't been a lot of space in climate change for young people. Right. So, I mean, it has been, if you think of the IPCC, that's a whole bunch of old white men, right? Scientists sitting around and issuing these reports. Right. And so I think we're still trying to figure out how do you take this data, because it is a very data heavy space, whether you're talking about the social science end where we exist or the climatological end, right? How do you take this data and make it real? So, for instance, one of our best posts on YCOM this year was using manure to fuel energy on farms. Just wildly popular, right? And so again, surprising ways with a little bit of crass humor. But I think you're right that I don't know that climate has had enough viral moments, right? I don't know that we have gotten traction in the way that some other social movements have. And that's something we're really struggling with. But that's because it is in some ways the worst issue, right? It's happening really slowly. It's far away. It's a risk that is going to happen in the future. And depending on where you are, you might not see it every day. And when we compare that to something like having access to healthcare or having access to equal representation in the law, ours is a harder story to tell. It really is.
So what are some takeaways for our listeners in terms of kind of ways that they can make sure that this gets out there more, that people are seeing this more, that climate change is something that we are talking about? You know, what would you encourage listeners to be thinking about?
Sure. So there is a phenomenon that we describe as the spiral of silence. And that's this idea that fewer than 1 in 3 Americans are talking about climate change with their friends and family. And the evidence shows that the issues and the ideas that you share among your peer group, your social network, are the most important. And that these cues that we get in our social networks about what's cool and what should be important and what should be the focus of the moment are some of the best ways to engage people and to convince people that issues should be addressed. And so I would just ask that listeners think about how are small ways, they do not have to be big, that they can break the spiral of silence. So for instance, when you do see something about climate change on social media, are you willing to share it, right? As you gather around, we've missed the holidays, but as we head into spring and we start getting outside again, praise be, are you talking about how much hotter it is? Are you talking about how spring is coming earlier? These conversational markers are so important to flagging to people. One, the people that I care about this issue. And two, this big, ginormous, knotted political issue has impacts on my small life. And so I think those are 3 things. So talk to the people you love about climate change, not about the science, but just about the changes you're seeing in the world. Be willing to share content. Of course, I can send you some links that puts climate change in people's feeds, puts it on their radar. And then the other one is, I think for a long time, particularly in the progressive space, I kind of felt like you had to believe all these things to be a climate champion. So not only did you have to believe it was real, you had to believe that you had to have the right percentage of the scientists who believe it's real, which is 97. And then you had to believe that it was mostly human caused, right? And then you had to believe that there was one elegant policy solution that we all needed to do. And I think that I've loosened up. And I think the movement needs to loosen up, and that it's okay if people say, well, I don't know how much of climate change is human caused. We don't need to argue about that because 85% of Americans support funding renewable energy development, R&D. 82% support tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles or solar panels. So I think we don't have to argue so that everyone has this kind of this exact same belief trajectory. What we need to do is start where we all agree. And that's that carbon dioxide emissions are hurting us. We need to control them. There are lots of different ways that we can control them, but we need to speedily transition away from fossil fuels. And I think that when we stick to that by and large, we can get a lot of people in the middle to come around.
Yeah, I like this idea of not having to do it all. That, I find something similar. I've been a vegetarian for a very long time, and I've been thinking about becoming vegan and sort of having to remind myself, you don't have to be completely vegan. You can just have vegan days, and sort of giving yourself that space to do some things, believe some things, and not worry about, are you perfect?
Exactly. There is no one perfect way to be a climate champion, just like there is no one perfect way to be an environmentalist, right? And I completely agree, because it can also be exhausting, right? And so it's exhausting, and it also induces guilt. And we know that people don't really respond well to guilt and shame, right? So I would much rather us start where people feel comfortable. And you're totally right. That can be different. That can be different for everyone. I'm also a family of flexitarians. And so you're exactly right. Just eating meat 2 fewer days a week, whether it's for that helps immensely with carbon stuff, right? All of the good things that we want to do in our communities, like have better parks, have more green spaces, those all help with climate change as well, right? And so it's almost overwhelming because there's too many solutions, and I don't want people to feel like, you've given me too many options. But the good news is there are lots of ways to do this. But I do think that that our elected officials just need to know that it's more of an issue. I think that's the one across the board. And again, I think that starts at cities and counties and even school boards.
Is there anything else that you want to make sure we talk about?
I think we talked about this among a group of women earlier this week who were at my house, and all of us worked in the environmental space. And I think it's really easy to be overwhelmed by bad news. And obviously, the last 2 years have seen some unraveling of some very important successes around climate change, in particular, the Clean Power Plan that I mentioned and the Paris Agreement. And I think it can be really easy to fall into sadness and a lack of empowerment. And we have to recognize those feelings, and those are real, and there is bad stuff happening. But please remind your listeners that there are lots of examples of good things happening too, right? We have mayors and governors and even congressional folks who are stepping up and saying, we're still in. We have small cities, even in rural areas, that are leaning into the clean energy economy as a way to replace jobs that were lost 40 years ago. And I know you have to search those out, but I would just encourage folks that take a time and search those out, because it will remind you that we do have hope and it's not all lost, and that there is positive stuff happening alongside some of our disappointments.
All right. Excellent. Well, Linsy, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And I'll put up a link to the YPCCC website so people can check that out and see the kind of stuff you're working on. And I love the graphics you guys put up on Twitter. That's just like a single stat that you can sort of be like, yes, look, share this. So I hope that people will share those things on Twitter as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us. And thanks for being willing to engage in this kind of somewhat thorny issue.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast.